Tennessee rage, Granny Fugate slaughtered 21 marshals who caged her grandson, then vanished into the hollow. They called her the Witch of Watauga, an old woman who had done what armies could not accomplish, slaughtered 21 federal marshals in 3 days of violence so complete that the government erased the incident from official records and pretended it had never occurred. For 45 years, she was nothing but a legend that marshals whispered about before assignments to the eastern Tennessee mountains, a story that explained why certain hollows were never entered, regardless of what warrants might require. But the witch was not supernatural. She was a woman named Delilah May Fugate, 74 years old when she began her campaign, and she had been watching from a hollow that no search ever discovered, until her body was found half a century after her grandson's torture had transformed her from mountain grandmother into mass murderer. This is the true story of the oldest slayer of federal officers in American history. Our story begins in the remote mountain section of Carter County, Tennessee, in the heart of the Appalachian Highlands, during the turbulent years of the late 1940s, when federal authority was expanding into regions that had governed themselves since before the nation's founding. The mountains rise here in great folds of ancient rock, their hollows sheltering families who had lived according to their own laws since the Revolutionary War, who measured justice not by what courts decided, but by what honor demanded. You see, in Carter County during the years of our story, the federal government had begun enforcing regulations with intensity that exceeded anything previous administrations had attempted. The Revenue Service had deployed marshals, whose methods would have shocked the civilized world, if that world had known what was occurring in hollows too remote for newspapers to reach. The families who had operated stills since before Tennessee was a state were being targeted with brutality that transformed enforcement into terror. The woman at the center of our story was born Delilah May Combs in 1873, in a cabin that overlooked the hollow, where her family had lived since 1789. She had married young, had borne 8 children, of whom 4 had survived to adulthood, had buried a husband, and watched grandchildren grow into adults who were now raising children of their own. She was 74 years old in the autumn of 1947, a grandmother whose appearance suggested nothing more threatening than the mountain hospitality that her generation had practiced throughout their lives. That's right. Delilah Fugate, known throughout the region as Granny Fugate, stood 5 feet 1 inch tall, had hair that had turned white before her 50th birthday, possessed eyes that were the pale gray of morning mist, and that seemed to see things that younger eyes missed. Her body was bent from 7 decades of mountain labor, her hands were gnarled from work that had never ended, but her mind remained sharp in ways that exceeded what her appearance suggested. She knew these mountains better than any map could document, knew secrets that had been passed from mother to daughter, since before anyone could remember. She had learned things from her own grandmother that the modern world had forgotten, knowledge that had been accumulated over generations of living in terrain that required capabilities the civilized world no longer possessed. She knew plants that healed and plants that killed, knew how to move through forest without leaving traces that any tracker could follow, knew techniques for survival that did not depend on tools or supplies that could be taken away. The knowledge lay dormant during the peaceful years of her widowhood, but it remained available for circumstances that would justify its use. Her grandson was named Samuel Fugate, 17 years old in the autumn of 1947, a boy whose gentle nature had made him beloved throughout the hollow, where the extended Fugate family lived. Samuel was different from the other boys his age, quieter, more thoughtful, more interested in books than in hunting, more comfortable with solitude than with the boisterous company that his cousins preferred. He was the child of Granny Fugate's youngest daughter, had been raised largely by his grandmother after his mother had died in childbirth and his father had fled to Ohio rather than face responsibilities that his character could not support. Samuel was the light of Granny Fugate's existence, the reason she continued living when age had taken everyone else she had loved. She had raised him from infancy, had taught him everything she knew, had watched him grow into a young man whose intelligence exceeded anything the local school could nurture. He was going to be something, she often told neighbors who asked about his future. He was going to leave these mountains and become something that would make his family proud. The trouble that would destroy this future began with the appointment of a new federal marshal named Vernon Crawford, whose mandate from supervisors in Nashville was to break the moonshine culture that had resisted federal authority since Prohibition began. Crawford had developed methods that previous marshals had been unwilling to employ, had determined that terror was more effective than prosecution, that examples made of certain families would discourage resistance among others. Crawford had identified the Fugate Hollow as a target because of its reputation for defiance, because family members had spoken publicly against federal enforcement, because breaking the Fugates would send a message throughout the region. The operation he planned required a victim whose suffering would be visible, whose fate would demonstrate what resistance produced. Samuel's age made him ideal, young enough to break easily, old enough that his treatment could be justified as enforcement rather than child abuse. The raid came on the night of October 15, 1947. Crawford led 21 marshals up the hollow with equipment that suggested intentions beyond mere enforcement. They brought a cage, an iron construction that had been built specifically for this operation, a device designed to hold a human being in conditions that resembled what farmers used for livestock. The cage was 4 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 3 feet tall, dimensions that would force any occupant into positions that the human body could not sustain without damage. The marshals did not find moonshine during their raid because there was no moonshine to find. The Fugate still had been dismantled months before, when the family had decided that the risk exceeded any benefit that continued operation might provide. But Crawford had not come for moonshine. He had come to make an example, and the absence of illegal activity would not prevent him from accomplishing his purpose. They took Samuel from his bed, dragged the 17-year-old from the cabin he shared with his grandmother, while Granny Fugate screamed protests that the marshals ignored. They stripped him of his nightclothes, forced him into the cage with blows that produced compliance, locked the iron door with a padlock whose key Crawford pocketed with satisfaction that his expression could not conceal. "This is what happens to families that resist federal authority," Crawford announced to the hollow, his voice carrying to every cabin where Fugates had gathered to watch what was happening. "This boy will remain in this cage until someone in this family provides information about moonshine operations in this region. The longer you remain silent, the longer he suffers. The choice is yours." The cage was positioned in the center of the hollow, visible from every cabin, placed where every member of the family would be forced to witness Samuel's suffering every moment of every day. Guards were posted to prevent any rescue attempt, rotated in shifts that ensured constant surveillance. The example that Crawford intended would be witnessed by everyone it was meant to intimidate. The cage itself was a horror of iron bars, spaced closely enough that Samuel could not extend any limb through them, could not find any position that allowed relief from the compression that the dimensions imposed. The bars were cold in the morning and hot in the afternoon sun, transferred temperature extremes that added to the suffering that the confinement itself produced. The floor was solid iron, offered no cushioning, conducted cold from the ground that seeped upward through metal, that retained temperature with efficiency that seemed designed for torture. The first hours were merely uncomfortable. Samuel's body was young and flexible, could adapt to the cramped position that the cage required. He drew his knees to his chest, wrapped his arms around his legs, bent his head forward in a posture that minimized the strain on his spine. He did not cry, did not beg, simply endured with a dignity that exceeded what his years should have provided. His eyes found his grandmother's face in the window of her cabin, held her gaze with an expression that communicated reassurance he could not speak. But the hours accumulated, and discomfort became pain, and pain became agony that no position could relieve. His muscles cramped with intensity that produced screams he could not suppress, spasms that racked his body, and that the confined space transformed into additional suffering as cramped limbs struck iron bars that would not yield. His spine curved in ways that the body was not designed to accommodate, vertebrae shifting to adapt to positions that adaptation could not make tolerable. His joints stiffened as circulation was impaired by positions that cut off blood flow to extremities that began to go numb. His feet turned colors that progressed from red to purple to gray, as blood pooled in tissues that the compressed position prevented from draining. His hands swelled until the fingers resembled sausages, until the joints ached with pressure that the swelling produced. The numbness was followed by tingling, and the tingling was followed by pain that exceeded what the cramping had produced. The guards tormented him throughout his captivity, found entertainment in the suffering of a boy whose only crime was belonging to a family that federal authority had chosen to destroy. They poked him with sticks through the bars of the cage, aimed for sensitive areas that produced reactions they found amusing. They struck the cage with rocks, created noise that reverberated through the iron structure and through the skull of the boy trapped inside. They laughed when he flinched away from contact that his confinement made impossible to avoid. They withheld water during hot afternoons, watched him grow desperate with thirst that they could have relieved but chose not to. His lips cracked and bled as dehydration progressed. His tongue swelled until speech became difficult. His eyes grew hollow as fluid that his body needed was denied by men whose power over him was absolute. They provided food irregularly, offerings that were inadequate and that were often spoiled or contaminated with substances that produced illness that the confined space made unbearable. Samuel developed diarrhea during the second week, was forced to soil himself while guards watched and commented, was left to lie in waste that accumulated beneath him as his body processed what little sustenance they permitted. They urinated on him when darkness provided cover, forced him to endure degradation that exceeded even the physical suffering. They called him names that carried through the hollow to where his grandmother listened, epithets that questioned his manhood and his humanity and his worth as a person. They treated him as something less than human, because treating him as human would have required acknowledging that what they were doing was monstrous. The nights were worst. The temperature dropped after sunset, and the iron cage conducted cold with the same efficiency it conducted heat. Samuel shivered through hours, when his body could not generate enough warmth to compensate for what the metal extracted. The guards did not provide blankets, did not offer any protection from cold that left Samuel's skin blue by morning, that produced hypothermia symptoms that repeated exposure eventually made chronic. Granny Fugate watched all of this from her cabin, watched her grandson suffer, while federal guards laughed at his pain. She was not permitted to approach the cage, was warned that any attempt to provide comfort would result in punishment that her age would not survive. She could only watch and listening, and feel something change inside her that would not change back until 21 men were dead. Samuel was kept in the cage for 21 days, 21 days of cramped confinement that permanently curved his spine, 21 days of torment that broke something in his mind that would never heal, 21 days of suffering that a grandmother was forced to witness, while federal authority prevented her from providing comfort that her love demanded. When they finally released him, when Crawford decided that the example had been sufficiently made, Samuel could not walk. His legs had atrophied beyond what 3 weeks should have produced, had been damaged by circulation that the cramped position had impaired. His spine had curved into a permanent stoop that he would carry for whatever remained of his life. His hands shook with tremors that would never cease, damage to nerves that the sustained cramping had produced, but the physical damage was less than the damage to his mind. Samuel emerged from the cage as something different from the boy who had entered it. He no longer spoke in sentences that made sense, no longer recognized people he had known his entire life, no longer showed awareness of the world around him, except when sudden movements or loud noises produced terror that manifested in screaming fits that nothing could calm. The boy who was going to be something, who was going to leave these mountains and make his family proud, was gone. In his place was a broken creature whose existence consisted of suffering that the cage had begun, but that continued long after the cage was removed. Crawford and his marshals departed, believing that their mission had been accomplished, that the example they had made would discourage resistance throughout the region. They did not understand what they had created in the cabin, where a grandmother watched a grandson, whose mind had been destroyed by torment that federal authority had inflicted, and that federal authority refused to acknowledge. Granny Fugate cared for Samuel in the weeks that followed his release, tended damage that her herbal knowledge could not repair, watched a grandson retreat further into madness that his suffering had created. She spoke to him constantly, tried to reach the boy she had raised through the trauma that had consumed him. Nothing worked. The Samuel she had loved was gone, replaced by something that wore his face but that did not recognize her. The transformation that occurred within Granny Fugate during these weeks was absolute. The grandmother who had spent 7 decades avoiding violence, who had raised children and grandchildren with gentleness that the community respected, ceased to exist. In her place emerged something older and colder, something that drew on knowledge she had hoped to never use, something that would not rest until every man who had participated in Samuel's torture had experienced consequences that exceeded what the legal system could provide. She began her preparations in November, gathering supplies from caches that previous generations had established against times when such supplies might be needed. She collected plants whose properties her grandmother had taught her, prepared compounds that could kill in ways that no physician would detect, and that could incapacitate in ways that would make killing easier. She studied the Marshals who had participated in Samuel's torture, learned their names and faces and routines through observation that no one detected. The attack began on the night of December 15, 1947, exactly 2 months after the raid that had taken Samuel. The first Marshal died in his sleep, his heart stopped by compounds that Granny Fugate had introduced to his food through methods that required proximity she had achieved by appearing harmless. He was found in the morning, his death attributed to natural causes that his age made plausible. The second and third Marshals died the following day, their deaths separated by hours and attributed to unrelated causes. One appeared to have fallen from a cliff during a patrol. The other seemed to have drowned while crossing a stream that he had crossed safely hundreds of times before. Neither death raised suspicion, because neither seemed connected to the other, or to any pattern that investigation might have revealed. That's right. Granny Fugate killed her first victims using methods that concealed the fact that killing was occurring at all. She exploited her appearance, an elderly woman whose presence suggested nothing threatening, to achieve proximity that younger killers could not have managed. She delivered death through hospitality that mountain tradition made impossible to refuse, through assistance that victims accepted without suspicion. But the concealed killings were merely preparation. The main assault required methods that would ensure every Marshal understood what was happening and why. The 4th through 10th Marshals were taken on the 3rd night, December 17, 1947, from a camp they had established in the hollow adjacent to Fugate territory. Granny Fugate had spent weeks studying this camp, had identified its vulnerabilities, had prepared approaches that the guards would not detect. She moved through darkness with skills that her grandmother had taught her, approached positions that the Marshals believed were secure. The camp consisted of 4 tents arranged in a square, with a fire pit in the center that provided warmth and light, but that also reduced the night vision of everyone who looked at it. 2 guards patrolled the perimeter in patterns that Granny Fugate had memorized over nights of observation. 5 Marshals slept in the tents, trusting the guards to protect them from dangers they did not believe existed. She approached from downwind, moved through terrain that seemed impassable, but that concealed routes she had known since childhood. The first guard was a man named Robert Harrison, 31 years old, who had been among the most enthusiastic tormentors during Samuel's captivity. He had developed a particular technique of striking the cage with a stick while making barnyard animal sounds, had reduced a 17-year-old to tears with cruelty that his colleagues had found entertaining. Harrison died without understanding what was happening. One moment he was walking his patrol, bored by routine that had grown comfortable. The next moment a hand covered his mouth while a blade found the space between his ribs that opened directly to his heart. He dropped without a sound, his body lowered to the ground by hands that were small but strong, his life ending in darkness that he had believed was empty. The second guard died 30 seconds later, struck from behind before he could process the absence of his partner. His name was Thomas Mitchell, 28 years old, and he had been the guard who had urinated on Samuel most frequently. His death was equally swift, equally silent, equally deserved by standards that Granny Fugate had developed during weeks of watching her grandson's torment. She did not kill them quietly. She killed them loudly, killed them in ways that ensured the survivors knew what was happening and who was responsible. The first guard died with his throat opened by a blade that had been sharpened to surgical precision, died trying to scream warnings that his severed windpipe could not produce. The second guard died seconds later, struck from behind, before he could respond to sounds that the first guard's death had created. Then Granny Fugate was among the sleeping marshals, moving through their camp with speed that belied her age, killing with efficiency that seemed impossible for a woman of 74 years. She entered the first tent and found 2 men sleeping on cots, their weapons positioned where they could be reached quickly, but where they could not be reached quickly enough. She killed the first with a blade across his throat, killed the second before his eyes could fully open, moved to the next tent before the blood had finished pooling beneath bodies that would not be discovered until morning. The third tent contained 2 more marshals, one of whom woke as she entered. His eyes widened in the darkness. His hand reached for a weapon that distance made irrelevant. He managed to shout once before her blade found him, a single word that might have been a name or might have been a prayer. His tentmate died without waking, without ever knowing that danger had entered. The final tent contained a single marshal, the man who had supervised the guards during Samuel's captivity, who had ensured that the torment was thorough and that the shifts were covered. He woke to find Granny Fugate standing over him, her face visible in moonlight that filtered through the tent's canvas, her blade dripping with blood that was still warm from previous applications. She killed 7 men in less than 3 minutes, killed them with a blade that opened throats and pierced hearts, killed them before they could organize resistance that might have stopped her. One marshal survived long enough to see her face, to understand what was happening before blood loss ended his consciousness. His eyes widened with recognition and with terror, comprehension arriving too late to save his life. "For Samuel," Granny Fugate said, the first words she had spoken since entering the camp. "For my grandson who will never speak sense again. For a boy you broke because your masters told you to break him. You die because he cannot." The 11th through 15th marshals died over the following 2 days, taken from positions throughout the county by methods that varied according to the circumstances. The 11th marshal, a man named James Crawford, no relation to Vernon, died from poison introduced to his canteen by hands he never saw. He had been alone on a patrol, had drunk without thinking, had collapsed within minutes, and had died within hours. His body was found the following morning, his death initially attributed to natural causes until the pattern began to emerge. The 12th and 13th marshals died together, ambushed on a road that they believed was safe. Granny Fugate had blocked the road with debris that required them to stop, had positioned herself where their attention would not reach, had killed them from angles they never anticipated. Their bodies showed evidence of violence that the first deaths had not, wounds that suggested rage was beginning to exceed efficiency. The 14th marshal died in his bed, in a boarding house that he believed was secure. Granny Fugate had entered through a window that locks could not protect, had crossed the room while he slept, had ended his life before consciousness could register danger. The boarding house owner found him in the morning, dead of wounds that no intruder could have inflicted, because no intruder could have entered without alerting the household. But an intruder had entered, had killed, had departed, without leaving any evidence of her passage. The 15th marshal was taken from a church, from Sunday services that he had attended seeking protection that divine presence might provide. Granny Fugate had waited outside, had followed him when he departed, had killed him in an alley that separated the church from the street where his vehicle was parked. His body was found with the same message carved into his flesh, "For Samuel." Each death was accompanied by the same message, carved into flesh or written in blood, "For Samuel." Crawford understood by December 19th that something was hunting his men, that the deaths which had seemed unconnected were actually a campaign that someone was conducting with patience and skill that exceeded anything he had anticipated. He gathered his remaining marshals in a fortified position, demanded reinforcements that his superiors were slow to provide, waited for an enemy whose identity he still did not suspect. The idea that an elderly woman was responsible for the deaths of 15 federal marshals exceeded what Crawford's understanding of the world could accommodate. He assumed he was facing men, multiple men probably, given the geographic spread of the killings, and he prepared accordingly. The preparations were useless against an enemy who did not match his assumptions. The 16th through 20th marshals died on the night of December 20th. Taken from the fortified position that Crawford believed was impregnable. Granny Fugate had spent 2 days observing the position, identifying weaknesses that Crawford had not noticed, preparing approaches that the defenses did not cover. She entered through a gap in the perimeter that the guards had not thought to secure, a space between buildings that seemed too narrow for anyone to use but that her small body could navigate. She moved through the compound like a ghost, eliminated guards before they could raise alarms, reached sleeping marshals before they could wake. The deaths were not quick. The guards who had tormented Samuel, who had poked him with sticks and urinated on him and laughed at his suffering, those guards died slowly, died experiencing terror that matched what Samuel had experienced during his 21 days in the cage. Granny Fugate ensured that each understood what was happening and why, that each heard Samuel's name before consciousness departed. Crawford was found the following morning, alone in his office, the sole survivor of a massacre that had claimed 20 of his men. He had barricaded himself inside when the killing began, had heard screams that continued for hours, had waited for dawn with terror that the sounds outside had not permitted him to escape. When he finally emerged, he found bodies arranged in positions that suggested ritual rather than mere violence. The marshals had been laid in a circle around the cage they had used to torture Samuel, their eyes open and staring at a device that had begun everything that followed. In the center of the circle, written in blood that had pooled from 20 wounds, were words that Crawford would remember for the remainder of his life. "My grandson's name is Samuel. He was 17 years old. He will never be the same. Now neither will you." Crawford fled the county that same day, abandoned his position and his responsibilities, never returned to Eastern Tennessee, regardless of what duty might have required. The official story, that his command had been eliminated by moonshiners who had attacked in force, was accepted without investigation. The truth was too terrible for the federal government to acknowledge, too damaging to the authority it was trying to establish in these mountains. But there was still one marshal remaining from the original 21, a man named Thomas Whitaker, who had been assigned to a different position on the night of the massacre, who had survived by accident of scheduling, rather than any skill or precaution. Whitaker had participated in Samuel's torture, had been one of the guards who had tormented the boy during his captivity. His survival was temporary. Granny Fugate found Whitaker 3 days later, found him attempting to flee the region in a vehicle that he believed would carry him to safety. She stopped the vehicle on a mountain road, emerged from forest with the blade that had ended 20 lives, approached a man whose terror showed that he understood exactly what was about to happen. "Please," Whitaker begged as she approached. "I was following orders. Crawford told us what to do. I didn't want to hurt the boy, please." "You laughed while my grandson screamed," Granny Fugate replied, her voice carrying the flatness of someone for whom emotion had been replaced by purpose. "You urinated on a 17-year-old while he lay in a cage that was too small for his body. You called him names that I heard from my cabin. You enjoyed his suffering. Now you experience your own." What she did to Whitaker exceeded what she had done to any of the others. His death extended over hours that the isolated road allowed, involved suffering that she had refined through 20 previous applications. He was the last to die, the 21st Marshal to experience consequences that federal authority had believed it was immune to. 21 federal marshals killed over 6 days by a woman who was 74 years old. The massacre was so complete and so devastating that the federal government spent decades pretending it had never occurred. Records were sealed, reports were classified. The deaths were attributed to causes that bore no connection to each other or to any unified campaign. But the mountain people knew. Word spread through networks that connected families across state lines, through whispers that carried truth, even when official sources carried lies. A grandmother named Granny Fugate had killed 21 federal marshals who had tortured her grandson, and she had vanished into a hollow that no search would ever discover. Granny Fugate disappeared into the wilderness that had always been her home, and she did not emerge for 45 years. The mountains of eastern Tennessee became her sanctuary, terrain that she knew better than any living person, that concealed her through decades of solitude that would have destroyed anyone with less purpose. She found a location that no search could discover, a hollow so remote that even the families who lived nearby did not know of its existence. The hollow was accessible only through a passage that her grandmother had shown her decades before, a gap in the rocks that appeared to lead nowhere, but that actually opened into a valley approximately a mile long and a quarter-mile wide. The hollow contained everything survival required. A stream that flowed year-round, soil that could support gardens, forest that provided timber and game and concealment from any search. She built a cabin against a rock face that provided one wall and protection from weather that might otherwise have made the location uninhabitable. The construction occupied her first year, gave purpose to days that might otherwise have been consumed by grief that her campaign had delayed but not eliminated. She built with techniques her grandmother had taught her, created a structure that would last through decades of occupation. The cabin was small but adequate, approximately 10 feet by 12 feet. A single room that contained everything she needed, and nothing that served no purpose. The rock face that formed one wall retained heat during winter and provided coolness during summer, a natural temperature regulation that reduced the fuel her fire required. She constructed a chimney from stones gathered from the stream, created a system that vented smoke effectively while minimizing the visible signature that might have attracted attention. She built furniture from timber that the hollow provided, created a bed and a table and chairs that were crude but functional. She constructed shelves for storing the provisions that survival required, built a cabinet for the journals that she began keeping from her first days of isolation. The construction kept her hands busy while her mind processed grief that threatened to overwhelm her. The garden she established occupied a clearing near the center of the hollow, a space where sunlight reached the ground for most of the day. She planted seeds that she had gathered from the garden at her home before the killing began, varieties that her family had cultivated for generations. The first garden produced poorly, the soil less fertile than she had hoped, and the growing season shorter than the plants required. She learned from the failure, amended soil with materials gathered from the forest floor, selected varieties that the conditions could support. Potatoes became her staple, hardy enough to survive the mountain conditions, and nutritious enough to sustain her through winters that lasted 5 months or more. She grew varieties that Samuel had helped her plant during the years before the cage had destroyed him. Seeds that carried memories she refused to surrender. Beans and squash provided variety. Herbs provided medicine and flavoring. Roots that grew wild in the forest supplemented what her gardens produced. She trapped small game that provided protein, constructed snares and deadfalls that captured rabbits and squirrels while she attended to other tasks. She learned the patterns of the animals that populated the hollow, identified the routes they traveled, and the times they moved. The trapping became routine over years of practice, produced reliable harvests that sustained her through seasons when other food sources were scarce. The first winter nearly killed her. The cold penetrated even her well-constructed cabin, found gaps she had not known existed, demonstrated that survival in this location would require preparations that her first year had not provided. She came close to dying multiple times during those months, from cold that her fire could not adequately address, from hunger that her stores could not satisfy, from grief that made survival seem pointless. But spring came eventually, as spring always does, and with it came renewal that she had not expected. She improved her cabin, sealed gaps that the winter had revealed, accumulated stores that would sustain her through the next cold season. She learned from the failures of her first year, applied the knowledge to improvements that each subsequent year refined. Samuel remained with her throughout her isolation, not physically. He had been taken to an institution that his condition required, but in her mind, in conversations that she maintained daily with a grandson whose voice she still heard despite the distance that separated them. She spoke to him constantly, told him about her days, asked his opinion about matters that survival required. The conversations might have been madness, but they sustained her through years when nothing else could have. She created rituals that gave structure to days that might otherwise have been formless. She rose with the light, performed tasks in sequences that became sacred through repetition. She visited a spot on a ridge that overlooked the direction where Samuel's institution was located, spoke to him across distances that her words could not actually cross. She ended each day with prayers that combined the Christianity of her upbringing with older beliefs that her grandmother had preserved. The grief did not diminish, but transformed into something she could carry. Samuel remained present in her existence, a companion whose voice she heard in her mind, and whose presence she felt in moments of quiet that the hollow provided. She built a small memorial to him near her cabin, a cairn of stones that she visited daily and that she decorated with wildflowers when the seasons permitted. "I killed them all," she told Samuel during one of these conversations, years into her isolation. "Every man who put you in that cage, every man who tormented you, every man who laughed while you screamed, they died understanding what they had done. They died knowing that their families would never learn what had really happened. I did that for you. I did it because it was the only thing I could do." She kept journals throughout her isolation, documented her days and thoughts in notebooks she made from materials the wilderness provided. The journals contained confessions that she intended to survive her, truths that she believed the world should eventually know. She wrote about Samuel constantly, preserved memories of the boy he had been before the cage had destroyed him. Samuel would be 35 now, she wrote in an entry from 1965, 18 years into her isolation. He would have married probably, would have had children of his own. He would have been something, a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher, something that would have made everyone proud. Instead, he lives in an institution where strangers care for a mind that federal marshals broke because their supervisor wanted to make an example. "I think about that every day. I will think about it until I die." She learned through networks that even her isolation could not completely sever that Samuel had died in 1958 at the age of 28. He had never recovered from the damage that the cage had inflicted, had spent his final 11 years in a condition that resembled existence without actually living. The institution that housed him had reported that he sometimes spoke coherently during his final months, had occasionally asked for his grandmother, had died with her name on his lips. The news nearly destroyed her. She lay in her cabin for weeks after receiving it, unable to eat or tend the fire or perform any of the tasks that survival required. She contemplated ending her existence, considered methods that would bring reunion with a grandson she had failed to protect. Something stopped her, perhaps the stubbornness that had allowed her to kill 21 men, perhaps the knowledge that Samuel's story would die with her if she did not survive to tell it. The decades accumulated with rhythms that the seasons provided. She watched the world change from vantage points that allowed observation without detection. She saw aircraft become common in skies that had been empty when her isolation began. She heard sounds of machinery that penetrated even her remote location. She observed evidence that the world was transforming while she remained anchored to a past that the present had forgotten. By the 1990s, Granny Fugate was in her 90s, had survived alone in the wilderness for over 4 decades, had maintained her existence through capabilities that most people would have found impossible. The strength that had allowed her to kill 21 marshals had long since faded, replaced by adaptations that her intelligence devised and that her determination implemented. She knew that her time was ending. The body that had served her through decades of solitary existence was finally surrendering to age that nothing could delay indefinitely. She prepared for death as she had prepared for everything else, with practicality that did not exclude reflection, with acceptance that did not preclude the determination that had always characterized her. She wrote final entries in her journals, messages for whoever might eventually find her remains. She explained that the journals contained truth that she wanted known, that the deaths of 21 federal marshals deserved explanation, that Samuel Fugate should be remembered alongside the vengeance that had answered his torture. Granny Fugate died in her cabin on December 15, 1992, 45 years to the day after she had begun killing the marshals who had tortured her grandson. She was 94 years old, had outlived everyone who might have remembered her, had maintained her existence through determination that exceeded what anyone would have believed a woman of her age could possess. Her body was found 3 years later, in 1995, by hunters who had wandered into the hollow through routes that should have been impassable. They discovered the cabin she had built, the evidence of 45 years of solitary existence, the journals that documented everything, the torture of Samuel, the deaths of 21 marshals, the decades of isolation that had followed. The journals were initially suppressed by federal authorities who did not want their contents becoming public. But leaks occurred, information spread, and eventually the truth that Granny Fugate had preserved became impossible to contain. The story she had told became part of the historical record, challenged official accounts that had been maintained for almost 5 decades. The revelation produced headlines across the country. The story combined elements that fascinated the public: maternal vengeance extended to grandmother, impossible survival, government cover-up, and truth that emerged only after everyone who might have been punished was long dead. Investigators who examined the historical records discovered evidence that supported Granny Fugate's account of what had been done to her grandson. Documents were found that confirmed Crawford's corruption, that confirmed the cage had been constructed specifically for torture, that Samuel's treatment had been ordered rather than spontaneous. The conspiracy that had destroyed him was exposed alongside the vengeance it had provoked. Granny Fugate was buried beside Samuel in a cemetery that had received Fugates since 1802. The inscription on her stone reads, "Delilah May Fugate, 1873-1992. They caged her grandson." She answered. She waited 45 years. Together again at last. Beside her, the stone that had marked Samuel's grave since 1958. Samuel Fugate, 1930-1958. Beloved grandson. Broken, but not forgotten. The songs that emerged from the Granny Fugate story were among the most powerful in modern Appalachian tradition, their subject matter requiring melodies that captured both the horror of a boy caged like an animal and the fury of a grandmother who killed 21 men to avenge him. The first verse described Samuel before the raid, the boy who was going to be something, the grandson who was the light of an old woman's existence. The melody was warm and hopeful, suggesting futures that should have been allowed to unfold. The second verse described the cage, the 21 days of torment, the grandmother forced to watch while federal authority prevented her from providing comfort. The melody became something terrible, notes carrying weight that seemed impossible for music to bear. The third verse described Samuel's release, the broken boy who emerged, the mind that would never heal from what the cage had inflicted. The melody grew quiet and mournful, suggesting loss that exceeded what death would have represented. The fourth verse described Granny Fugate's transformation, the grandmother who became something else, as she watched a grandson retreat into madness. The melody grew cold and purposeful, suggesting fury that would not be denied. The fifth verse described the killing, 21 marshals dying over 6 days, Crawford fleeing a county where his authority had been destroyed. The melody had an inexorable quality, suggesting fate that age could not prevent. The final verse described the 45 years of hiding, the grandmother who became a ghost in a hollow that no search discovered, the grandson who remained alive in conversations that she maintained until death finally brought reunion. The melody resolved into something approaching peace, suggesting that patience, however extreme, eventually receives its reward. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand at the graves where Granny Fugate rests beside the grandson she avenged, to read the inscriptions that tell of broken lives and decades of solitude? Would you walk through the hollow, where she survived for 45 years? Would you try to understand how love and fury could sustain a life that had lost everything except the memory of what it had possessed? The journey to Carter County is easier now than it was in 1947, the roads paved, and the world more connected than it was when federal marshals caged a 17-year-old to make an example of his family. But the mountains remain, ancient and patient, holding their memories close, like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. The graves of grandmothers and grandchildren rest in those mountains, and the stories of what was done and what was done in response echo still through hollows that have witnessed both injustice and its answer. And that, my friend, is the true story of Tennessee Rage, the grandmother named Granny Fugate, who slaughtered 21 marshals and vanished for 45 years into a hollow that no search ever found. A story of love that became fury, that became decades of solitude, that ended only when death brought reunion that life had denied. The mountains remember, and through them, so do we all. So there you go, my friend. Now you know the rest of the story. Granny Fugate killed 21 federal marshals who had caged her grandson for 21 days and broken his mind beyond any hope of repair, then disappeared into a hollow for 45 years until her body was found with journals that explained everything. What about you? If federal marshals caged your grandson for 3 weeks while you watched helplessly, if he emerged broken in ways that would never heal, could you kill 21 men at the age of 74? Could you survive alone in the wilderness for 4.5 decades, sustained only by conversations with a grandson who lived only in your memory? The mountains don't answer such questions. They simply endure, keeping their secrets and their dead. And some grandmothers love their grandchildren so completely that 45 years of isolation is merely the space between torture and reunion. Thanks for listening to this story. And as always, remember that the hills have eyes and the hollows have memories. Be careful what you do in these mountains, because the mountains never forget, and neither do the grannies who call them home.